All right. So when I very first released Ethereal, which later became Wireshark, it wasn't obvious that setting this thing out in the world that's open source would be successful. And if we weren't where we are today, a good question to ask might be, what were you thinking? Why did you release this as open source? So I thought I'd go into a little bit of detail today about the background that led up to my decision to make Wireshark open source. Wireshark was released under the GPL, which stands for the GNU General Public License. And my introduction to the GPL was not like most people. Most people are introduced to the GPL through maybe some blog post or an article or actual GPL software. Mine was over 30 years ago. I don't want to, well, I'll just tell you I'm old. I went to university a long time ago. But it was at a class I took called Ethics of Computer Usage, and we studied all sorts of philosophical issues as they apply to technology. And it was a great class. If you have an opportunity to take a class like that, I totally recommend it. But we did a lot of things like, along with studying general philosophy, we also studied some things like the movie RoboCop, the original Paul Verhoeven one, which was famous for being really, really violent, but at the same time it covered some interesting philosophical issues like what happens to personhood if you start replacing parts of a person? At some point you have something that's no longer a person. What rights do they have? We had breakfast with Roger Beaujolais. If you don't know who that is, he's the person that let the world know that the Space Shuttle Challenger blew up because the solid rocket booster O-rings were too cold. He was the whistleblower in that situation. And it was really great to meet him. And at the very end of the semester, my professor handed out these photocopied sheets of paper with this really strange software license on it that gave people a lot of rights as regards to the software. And say in a book or in the movies, this is the point where the lights shine down from the heavens and I realized that this is my life's work. In real life, that didn't happen. It was just an interesting thing we studied in class. So. The thing is, I was exposed to the GPL then, and a couple of years later, I got my first job as a programmer. Well, not quite, but I was still in college, and I got a job for a day at a company that made automobile insurance rating software, meaning you go in to see your insurance agent, and they would type in your information into a Turbo Pascal program, and it told you how much your insurance was going to be. And this was a one-person shop. The company was just one person, and this software gave him his livelihood, and he was very protective of it. So he saved the source code to 2 floppy disks. That's where the code lived, and he took that home each night. He was so paranoid about the code that he did very unusual things. I don't know how many of you are software developers, but he didn't use variable names. Instead of having the integer with some name associated like driver age, instead, he took that and stuffed it into an array of, integer number 85. And you had to remember what that meant wherever you were in the code, and it was really strange. But looking back, like the title of the slide says, this is the exact opposite of open source. You weren't supposed to get the source code, and if you got the source code, you weren't supposed to be able to understand what it was doing or be able to use it at all. So a little while later, I got a job at the university where I was attending, and I had a job as a VMS operator. And if you don't know what VMS is, it's an operating system that ran on computers made by Digital Equipment Corporation called VAXs. And our VAX was huge. It was about the size of 3 refrigerators, and it was used by thousands of people around the campus, and it required a team of people to maintain it, including me. But the thing to note is that it had a weird operating system and it was unusually sized, but it was still a computer. It had CPUs and memory and network connection and CD-ROM. It had a tape drive, which is unusual today, but it was completely normal back then. But I remember one day I was looking for something in the operator's desk, and I was looking in a drawer and found this box, and it had a bunch of microfiche in it. And the microfiche had the source code to VMS. Apparently, at that time, if you asked Digital Equipment Corporation for the source code to VMS, they said, yeah, sure, here you go, but we're not going to give it to you in a useful format, like on a CD-ROM or on a tape. We're going to tell you that you need a steady hand and a magnifying glass, and here's some microfiche. Today, there are similar situations with a license called shared source, or a type of license, where people will give you the source code, but you can't do anything with it. And that's actually causing a bit of confusion nowadays, as to the difference between shared source and open source, because people say you got the source code, but I can't do stuff with it. After that, I got a job at the same university. I switched roles. I became a Unix administrator, and that's actually where I got my first real hands-on exposure to open source. And my job was to install software on all the different Unix machines that were on campus. And what I would typically do would, do what everybody else did at the time. I would download a tarball and then unpack it and run these 3 magic commands: configure, make, and make install. The first command, configure, figures out what the machine looks like and what's on it. Make builds the software, and make install puts the software where it needs to go. And I did this quite a bit, and it was like a breath of fresh air compared to all the other experiences I had with software at that time, because I didn't need to fill out a purchase order or mount some magnetic tape on a machine somewhere, or I don't even know if you remember that people used to make parallel port license dongles for like CAD software. And so people, and other types of software, and I remember seeing a couple of machines with like 4 or 5 or 6 of these little blocky parallel port chunks out the back of the computer, and so they had to move their computer forward on their desk because it wouldn't, scoot back any further. But I didn't have to do any of that with open source. I just downloaded it and installed it. It was, you're done. And I don't think these 3 commands get enough credit because it's really great. I love open source. I love the concept and I love the ideals of open source, but you aren't going to get people to adopt that unless you remove barriers to actually using the software. And back then, these commands were the thing that removed that barrier to entry and let people kind of explore open source software. One of my other jobs as a Unix administrator, which was similar to most other Unix administrators, was to take care of the network. And we had a typical computer network, college campus computer network at the time, which meant that we had a bunch of different protocols that we ran, like, IPv4, everybody ran that, and IPX, but we ran DECnet, which is kind of unusual, and some people didn't have AppleTalk, we did. We had a whole bunch of different physical layers, like Ethernet, FDDI, a little bit of frame relay, maybe some token ring. We ran SLIP because I'm so old that PPP wasn't a thing that existed yet. And we had exactly one sniffer. And that's the thing that I would lug around campus. It was very heavy, and I'd plug it in, and that's how I learned to analyze networks. After that, I got a job at an ISP, and the ISP didn't have a budget for a sniffer, so I still had the job of installing Unix software and taking care of the network, but I didn't have a really good tool for analyzing the network. I mean, we had TCP dump and snoop, and those are actually really good and useful for the tasks that they were designed for, but for some things you just need to really interactively look at packets and browse them, and I kept asking my boss, and we just never had the budget for a sniffer, so I decided to start writing my own, and that's when I started writing the initial code for Ethereal. So up at this point, as you can see, I needed a sniffer. I had studied computer science in college, and I'd had this exposure to open source and exposure to a lot of closed source software that was kind of weird. And so it was an obvious thing to me at the time that, hey, I should release this as open source, and I like the GPL, so I used that license. And but like the slide said, at that time for me, free software meant maximizing user freedoms, and closed source kind of was weird. So I did the thing that was unusual at the time, which was releasing an open source program. Nowadays, if you release something as open source, nobody really cares because everybody does it. You just go to GitHub and I wrote a thing. But so what does it mean to be open source? The main definition is that you release it under a license that complies with a set of licenses put out by an organization called Open Source International, OSI, and usually it's like the GPL or the BSD or MIT license, but those licenses cover usually the same set of things. They deal with how you might use the software and who might be able to modify it, and when what happens when you go to distribute it, what obligations you have. The GPL, which is the license we use, says that you can use the software for anything if you're a user. Literally, it says you can literally use this for anything you want. The restrictions come in when you're distributing the software. When you take a piece of GPL software and give it to somebody else, you have to pass on all the rights that you got to the person that you're handing it to. And that was one of the appealing things to me about the GPL, and that's why I kind of went with it. Another thing to note is that software licenses are kind of a new thing, at least taken in context with the history of law. And so they typically apply to written works, like, so copyright law applies, the same law that applies to books and music and things like that. Trademark law doesn't really apply to open source, at least the licenses don't deal with that. So that was a notable point for us when I changed jobs in 2006, because as I said, the original name of the project was Ethereal, and my old employer had the trademark on Ethereal, and we couldn't come to an agreement on transferring the name over. So even though we had this source code that was available under the GPL that we could do anything we wanted with, we couldn't do what we wanted to do. We couldn't take the name with us, and that's why the software stayed the same, but the name changed in 2006 from Ethereal to Wireshark. The thing that I find weird today is that, excuse me, the software licensing, the open source and free software licensing landscape is still evolving. I mean, this stuff has been around for decades, and you would think that, we'd be good. I mean, we would have sufficient licenses now, but for whatever reason, people are still unhappy with the licenses that are available right now at this time, and so they keep writing new ones, or keep trying to do weird things with existing ones and things like that. And as the slide says, sometimes they do this out of fear, out of anger, and that happened recently with AWS. AWS, Amazon Web Services, has all these services that they offer you, and some of those are based on open source projects, and some of those projects are backed by private companies, and so Amazon's really big, and those companies tend to get scared of this huge company that wants to do stuff with their software. So in a couple of cases, projects have started out open source, and then Amazon adopts them, and then the company says, well, we changed our mind, we're going to make it closed source now. So there's been a lot of controversy around that. There's also some controversy around the Free Software Foundation, the fact that Richard Stallman had to step down, but I don't have enough slides to cover that situation today, sorry. Just Google it. So Wireshark is available as an open source program. What does that get you? Well, it got us a lot of downloads, for one. It got us into a situation where we evolved into a really popular project, and we're actually doing pretty well. On the slide it says we get over 1 million downloads a month. The real number, I think, the last few months has been over 1.2 million. Most of those are Windows, but that might change if we ever introduce automatic updates for Mac OS. We'll see. And we support a bunch of different protocols and have a lot of lines of code. But the thing that it gets you, in our case, is a wonderful community, a wonderful community of users and developers and people who are happy to help each other and contribute. And it's something that I'm really happy and proud to be part of. And now it's probably a good time to bring up some of the people who have made Wireshark what it is today and so successful. I'd like to invite some of the core developers to come up. Wow, we have a lot of people. This is like half the conference up here.
We need a bigger stage.
Here, I'll get out of your way. No, I was just wondering if you guys could maybe introduce yourselves and let the crowd know what you do and maybe tell them how you were introduced to open source. Did you watch RoboCop?
I did watch RoboCop, but I never knew about it. I never thought about it philosophically, though.
Yeah.
Well, good morning. I'm Sake. As you might have heard already, I come from the Netherlands, and my introduction to open source and to Ethereal back in the day was I think it was in 1999 when I was working at a bank, and somebody said, "Hey, look at FreshMeat. There's this little product called Ethereal, and you're analyzing packets. This might be something for you." And that's the beginning of a journey that lasted for 20 years, putting me upstage here, changing my careers to working for myself, presenting at conferences, and yeah, it's one little comment from a colleague could just change the course of your life in a basic way, like it did with you. Yeah. So yeah.
Hi, I'm Richard Sharp, and I didn't watch RoboCop until relatively recently, when Jeremy Allison suggested that I watch the scene, the very violent scene where that young guy gets shut up by the robot in the original part. But I was first introduced to Ethereal as well back in like 1999 or 1998 or something like that, when I was teaching TCP/IP classes, and at that time we had this awful DOS-based sniffer and packet analyzer, and to do that segment we had to boot out of Windows 95 into DOS and then run it and stuff like that. And so after I found Ethereal, I then found that it didn't quite have the protocols that I wanted, so I started adding those protocols, and I think Graham or somebody had already organized to have it built under Windows, so fairly quickly I had the tools that I needed that we could ditch this DOS program, and made my teaching life easier. And I've been involved with it since that time, on and off.
Hello, my name is Tomasz. I'm working in Poland at Etteplan as a software engineer. I basically write the firmware for different devices, and I'm mostly, in Wireshark, I'm mostly doing the USB side. Back in 2012, I was actually reverse engineering one device, guitar multiprocessor USB protocol that it was using. And I just wanted it for Linux. So I knew that Wireshark can capture the USB traffic on Linux. I did it really horribly complicated way on Windows. But then, as I was soon to graduate, I thought, well, I might add this USB capture on Windows. So this is how USB pickup basically came to life. That was my Master of Science project, and soon after it was really, getting a lot of attention, and people started using it. I'm quite surprised how many people have downloaded it, and also that it made it to the Wireshark for Windows installer. That's really something that really surprised me. And right now, I just want Wireshark to be like the ultimate USB analysis software. So I wanted to make that no matter if you use the software sniffing with USB Mon on Linux or USB pickup on Windows, or if you go all the way down to the wire and use OpenVisual hardware USB sniffer, I just want you to be able to use Wireshark to analyze all the protocols, all the encapsulated protocols within protocols, which Wireshark is really good at. So, yeah, and I wrote this USB audio dissector in 2012, and recently I looked at it, and it was so amazing how people have improved it over the time.
Hello. Sorry. Hello, everybody. My name is Dario. I'm from Italy, and I've been a core developer since 2016. My first experience with open source software was back in 2003, more or less. And it was about John, the distributed version of John the Reaper, the popular password cracking software. And I basically found something that didn't work, so patching the code and pushing it upstream was just the obvious thing to do. But at the time, Git didn't exist, GitHub didn't exist, SVN was at the very beginning, so everything was basically managed through emails. So all developers exchanged the diffs through emails, and the code was merged. So that's what I did, and it worked, and that was my first experience.
Good morning, my name is Jaap. My first experiences with open source software was somewhere in the microcomputer era when listings were published in magazines and you digitally type them over into your console and try to compile it and see if it run yes or no and whatnot. That progressed through time. And in 2004, I was working for a business telephony company, designing and building telephone exchanges, and we were doing the big IP migration, so voice over IP stuff. And since we didn't have any tools, we looked around and we stumbled upon this project as an alternative for the very expensive tools which were available in the market. Of course, it didn't have the features we needed, so we started to contribute code. That's how I got involved, and eventually Gerald got fed up with sending patches, so he said, okay, you can commit them yourself. So that's how I became a core developer in this way.
Hello, I'm Stig from Norway. So about 20 years ago, I worked in this company. We made software for military protocols. And we used to debug the protocols on the code side. And it was very hard because it was complex protocols. So one day, one of my colleagues came and said, okay, you need to use this it-reel to capture the packets. And I said, okay, I will try that. But of course, it didn't have our protocols, because it was military protocols, and they were a bit hard to understand. So then I started to create dissectors for these protocols. So I nagged my boss, I think 2 or 3 years, if I could open source this, because it wasn't really closed protocols, it was just this military, so it was supposed to be secret, but it's not. So eventually I got okay to open source it, and then we start using Wireshark more, or it-reel more and more, making internal patches, which we fed upstream to this mailing system Dario was talking about. And I think I came to a point I had so many patches, they just invited me to be a core developer, to do it myself. So nowadays I switched job. We are doing microcontrollers, doing Bluetooth, low energy, Zigbee, Thread, LTE stuff. So I switched my main focus to other protocols, but I'm still doing a lot of now Wireshark improvements in that areas. Yes.
Hey, I'm Peter from Netherlands, but now in UK. I guess my involvement in open source started back in 2011, and I just got a new laptop and was installing Ubuntu on it, and not everything worked. But luckily, well, in the ecosystem of Ubuntu, like pretty much all source code is available, so I can pick the source code, study it, and I found a group of people actually working on the problem I was having. So I then joined them and basically learned a lot. And yeah, that's especially something I like about open source. You can typically pick the source code of the application that you're using, inspect it, learn whatever error, where an error comes from, and if necessary, fix it up. This is also how I got involved in Wireshark later. I had an issue with TLS decryption. I got the source code, looked up the error, and tried to fix it. And over time, I fixed more of it. And in 2015, I guess, I became a core developer, where I continued working on TLS, TCP, and all kind of related protocols. Yeah, that's about it, I guess.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Pascal. I'm from France. My first contact with open source as a user was in the previous century, when I was in university, like probably most of you. Then in 2002, I had this teammate who was working on a web browser in a phone. I don't know if you remember this. People pretended it was like internet, but it was kind of not the reality. And they were using this very old software named Ethereal so as to try to figure out what's happening and try to debug their stuff, which was my first contact. But I was not working in IP stuff. I was working on the wireless modem embedded in the phone by that time. Then a few years later, in another company, I started using Wireshark, because there was this name change in between, to debug our own wireless protocols. Then I started contributing. It was in 2008, and then during 4 years, I sent patches and patches and patches, and at some point they got fed up. And they decided to get me on board, and since it's been a great journey, it helped me getting my current job, so yeah, it was really worth it.
Good morning, my name is Roland, I'm from Austria. I've been using open source since 1997, when I first installed Linux. Back then it was a 0-something version, and I was a very avid Linux user from the get-go, so I had no clue there was something called DNS and resolve-conf, and what the heck do you need that for? So I dual booted to Windows, captured the IP addresses of all the websites I wanted to visit, went back to Linux, edited a hosts file to add all the IP addresses, and at that point decided I will never have to do anything with networking because that's just too complicated to use. About 8 years later, I did a second course at the university, and we had one good thing every teacher does when he wants people to get hooked to networking. He made us do a Cisco CCNA class, which is always really fun and avid using. And again, I was hooked to this tool called Ethereal and doing some CCNA debugging, and I was always never doing networking in my life. That's just unbelievably stupid. But I joined a company doing safety machine software, and it turns out that most of the safety machine software was run on industrial Ethernet networks. And at that time, safety machine was something of a closed source because everybody wanted to keep his own secrets and they didn't want to share stuff. So they told me that, yeah, you can dissect it, but you have really to learn which byte means what, because we're not making anything and it's not possible to do and you can't do anything with that. And then I got hooked because, well, I'm a very stubborn guy, and if you tell me it's not possible to see that in some clear text form where people actually can read what 08 means and understand it, then I'm gonna start working on it. And this is when I turned back to Wireshark and thought, well, maybe I give this another try, and started implementing the open safety dissector and got to learn the wonderful world of Bugzilla patch submitting. Which, by the way, is really good. Please do. If you ever have some issues with Wireshark, please send us bug reports. And then I needed some external capture interface and took over some, and this is when I really got hooked to open source, because in 2013, two guys at SharkFest made a presentation, Mike Kershaw and Mike Ryan, about an external capture interface and how cool that was and how they could solve some issues with that. But sadly, due to various other occupations they had, they never came around to finishing the project. And I just wrote an email to both of them and asked for permission to use the source code and get it working in Wireshark. And this is pretty much all the interfaces you see which have a nice little icon on the front. Those are the external capture interfaces. And as it turns out, it's used by quite a few people. Sadly enough, also by Stick, because he's complaining about all my bugs I'm doing. So that's my job currently. I'm the UI guy in the GUI and making the bugs Stick can fix. So we keep him occupied and he doesn't get rusted up.
Hi everyone, my name is João. I'm from Portugal. And I was first introduced to open source in university because, well, all the classes were based on the GNU toolchain. All the labs were running Linux machines. And for me, at the time, this was completely new because before that, it was all Windows and closed source. And it was a new reality for me. And actually, it's one of the things I'm most grateful about from my college experience and education, because it's been a lot of, I got hooked into open source, and it's been a lot of fun ever since. And so by the end, I was working on a project writing a custom protocol. And of course, I wanted to check my implementation and look at my packets on the network. And at that time, looking at packets in Wireshark was already like a synonym. So I fired up Wireshark, and of course it didn't support my custom implementation of IPv6, of an IPv6 extension header. So I had to write it, and that pretty much also shows the power of open source, because I had the source in front of me. I started working on it. It was great, easy to work on. And at the same time, when you're looking at the source code and working on it, you always see, okay, maybe this could be changed, or this could be improved. And step by step, I started contributing to the project, got involved in the community, and it's been since 2015 been involved in the project, and it's been a lot of fun. It's easy to contribute if you know a little bit of C. So I encourage all of you that are interested in it to have a look and check if in your field of expertise you might find something that you'd like to improve or contribute and get involved. Thanks.
Morning, everyone. My name's Graham. I'm from the UK. My day job is SCADA software, telemetry control systems. I first became aware of open source, I think, in the 80s on the Amiga. There was some GNU utilities, and I messed around with Linux in the early 90s. But my main focus in my commercial day job was on Windows. And as telemetry protocols moved from the 80s and 90s to being serial-based over to IP-based, then Ethereal became much more viable for looking at all our protocols. So I got involved then because there were some errors in the protocols that we use, Modbus and things like that. And then after a little while, I got really fed up because on Windows at that time, you couldn't do live capture. You had to capture and then open the file and look at it. So I did a fair bit of work there, enabling live capture on Windows, and submitted it and was accepted in as a core developer at that time, late 90s. So 20 years now, I think I've been part of this great team. And it is the power of open source that we have the flexibility to go and change all these things. And we also meet a lot of like-minded individuals that are also ready to share their time and their knowledge and their expertise, as we do at the whole conference. And everybody really enjoys that aspect of the project.
Hi, my name is Anders Broman. I work for Ericsson. I was working as a tester, and the system at the time was a little bit like an open source system. As a tester, you had access to the source code of the system. It had really good built-in trace possibilities, so you could see what's happening and actually write assembler fixes and load them into the system to get the bugs fixed. But then around 2000, we were moving into voice over IP stuff and Ethernet-based communication, and someone introduced me to this tool, Ethereal, that had similar capabilities. You could see what was going on in the system and do traces and find what went wrong. But of course, it was lacking in the area of our protocols, and I also needed to learn about some new protocols. So I thought, well, let's write the protocol dissector for this and see how that goes. And 15 years later, here we are. And I think I'm probably the one who has written the most dissectors, 50 or 60 dissectors, I think. So, yeah, that's it.
Thank you, guys. Did you want to say anything else, or? Yeah. Yeah. So, when one of the weird parts of my career is it happens when people ask me what I do for a living. Because, like, if it's one of my neighbors, I freeze up because I think, okay, how do I explain very quickly and in a way that won't bore the crap out of them what I do? Because I have to explain what open source is and protocol analysis and the fact that we're this large distributed team with this large, wonderful community, and how do I summarize that? And I just kind of freeze up, and then I say computers, and then I go, do. But I hope, after hearing what all these guys had to say, it is more obvious that, what I do for a living is to make sure that their jobs are as easy as possible, because, they, in a lot of cases, this is volunteer work, or, their employer might pay them to work on Wireshark, but at the same time, their employer doesn't pay them to struggle with developing with Wireshark. I need to make sure that their jobs is as easy as possible, and I need to make sure that your job is, as far as downloading and installing and interacting with Wireshark, is as easy as possible. And so, that aspect of my job is to identify any sort of barrier to entry that there is with the project and try to eliminate that. And I'm very happy and I'm very grateful that I get paid to work on this full time. I mean, my Riverbed pays me to take care of Wireshark, and that's my job. And a couple of people have asked me what I do for a living so far here at SharkFest and in previous conferences, and I say, well, I work on Wireshark full time, and then their eyebrows just go like that, because you can do that. Yeah, well, I can, but that leads to a question. We have this wonderful thing. We have a wonderful project. How do we ensure that it stays wonderful and that we keep this thing going? I mean, I want to come back here someday for another SharkFest. This is awesome. So how do we keep doing that? Right now, we're in a pretty good place, and let's see how much time we. I don't know how much time we have left, but we'll see. We're in a good place. Wireshark right now, it's evolved like a lot of other open source projects in that we have a governing model called BDFL. That stands for Benevolent Dictator for Life. And it's kind of a natural thing when, especially for new projects when they're starting out, that you have somebody who creates the project and they're in charge of the project. It's something they started and something that they make all the decisions on. And but it's also the case that a lot of large projects have BDFLs. The most famous one is Linux. Linus Torvalds is BDFL for Linux. I mean, that may be the project where this term originated. I don't recall, but. And with Python, although he stepped down a while back, Guido van Rossum, who created Python, he was their BDFL for a long time. And so when I look around for examples of governance for projects, I look at places like that, and they're doing okay with BDFLs, so maybe I can do that too. But this also introduces a risk, and I'll talk about it in more detail in the next slide. But if anything happens to me, I mean, the project's going to go on. I'm not self-centered such that I think that if I go away, the project's going to die. I mean, the project's going to continue. I have 100% faith that these guys would continue that on if something were to happen to me. But we need to figure out how that would progress. Another risk we have with the project is that we have a wonderful sponsor. Riverbed is happy to pay for hosting all of our servers and paying my salary and helping out with SharkFest, but at the same time, they're just one company. If something happened to Riverbed or if they changed their mind, we would have to go look for funding elsewhere. And so those are a couple of things we have to consider. I mean, in the networking world, of course, we call these single points of failure. Another term I ran across a while back is bus factor. There's a Wikipedia page on bus factor, and it's defined as the number of people in your organization that can get hit by a bus before your organization is adversely impacted. And in this case, we have bus factors of 1, and for leadership and for funding. Something that we do have is called the Wireshark Foundation. It's just enough of a corporate entity that lets me go do things on behalf of the project, like go pay for instances at AWS or buy development software or code signing certificates. And that's actually very useful. This is the thing that lets the project be an official thing. When you download Wireshark for Windows, it's that executable is signed, and it's signed as the Wireshark Foundation Inc., and we can do that legally, and that's really handy, and it actually lends the credibility to the project that we need to for people to install it. But the problem is that as I said on the previous slide, there's a bus factor of 1 or a single point of failure here, and that I'm the only one allowed to do things right now for the Wireshark Foundation. I'm the CEO. None of these guys are, and adding them to the company would be problematic in a lot of cases because their employer would say, "Well, why are you working for this? You work for us." And so are some organizational things that we need to sort out. And so that's something that we've been talking about for a while, and we're actually talking about it at SharkFest as well, where we're going to take the governance of the project. The problem is that we're kind of late in the game here, and so we're not the only one with this problem. Every other open source project of any significant size has had this problem, and the open source being open source, they've come up with a whole bunch of different solutions for this. Probably a unique solution for every project almost, and so we have all these options. We could join what's called an umbrella organization. The big examples of that would be, say, the Linux Foundation or the Apache Software Foundation or Software Freedom Conservancy. But these are organizations set up to handle the legal and accounting and other administrative services for open source projects. And the goal is that they take care of the kind of the detail-oriented, boring stuff that the overhead part of the project and then lets you focus on producing software and interacting with your community, the things that you actually want to do. The problem there is there are a whole bunch of umbrellas. There are literally dozens, and if we go that way, then we have to choose one. We could go with an independent not-for-profit, either here or in Europe or in the US. We could set up, instead of making the Wireshark Foundation this little private corporation, make it an actual not-for-profit. And that would be an option, but that's a lot of boring work that I don't want to do. We could also make a for-profit company, but that means that we have to have a business model and actually be viable and have make money. That sounds like too much work to me. I'm lazy. And we could also go with a different corporate overlord. Switch from Riverbed to another main sponsor, but I don't find that appealing either. And so these are some considerations that we've had for the future of the project and stuff that we talked about. So what the core developer team, and then I have been working on is, like I said, figuring out what's next for the project. And we had a meeting yesterday, and I think, made some progress. I'm really happy about, but I need to get in contact with some other people and before I can announce anything publicly. But hopefully we'll have some news soonish at some point. Let's see, and as the slide says, I'm hoping to be able to announce something. I'm hoping, later this year, like maybe in the next few weeks, but we'll see. So to kind of summarize for the project, we're in a really good place, and I want to keep us in a good place, or let us move to a place that's even better, although I don't know how we would top being here at the Hotel Palacio, but we'll see. Near the ocean. What are we going to be on the actual ocean? But we'll see. If you have any questions or comments about where we might go with the project, you're certainly welcome to come by the developer den and talk to us about that, or anything else about the project. Let's see, I had one last slide. I don't know if you guys recall, at the very beginning of the presentation, I had a picture of a couple of floppy disks. And these actually have some historical significance for the project. For this presentation, I wanted some pictures of floppies, and I remembered I had some in the garage, so I grabbed them and took pictures. And it wasn't until I actually looked at them closely that I realized that these are the floppies that I used to install the very first web server for the project, ethereal.zing.org. I don't know if you can read the label, but that's Red Hat 5.1, not Red Hat Enterprise Linux, the original old school Red Hat, and it was for Sun SPARC systems. And there's a RAM disk and a boot disk, and that's what I used to install Red Hat on this little Sun SPARC Station IPX, and that was our very first web server, and that's what hosted the project initially. And these are the floppies I used to set it up. So I don't say that's where it all began, but that's something that let me begin it. But anyway, enough boring trivia. Whenever I get up here on the stage, I make sure to point out that Wireshark is a great and wonderful thing, and that's not because of me. It's because of you. It's because of everybody here. The people who use Wireshark, the people who develop it, the people who teach people how to use Wireshark, and it's a great honor to be part of this. And this time, as you know, it's very bittersweet because this is the last SharkFest that Janice is going to be part of, and she's not here, but I do want to say that I'm very thankful to have been able to work with her, and you guys don't realize how much of an impact that she's had on this project, and I am going to miss her dearly. So I don't know. Janice, can you hear me? Well, like I said, I'm going to miss her dearly, but I just wanted to say thank you.